Well, hello everyone. Welcome to How to Protect Your Project from Start to Finish. This is part 3, Project Budget Development. This is a Clear on Black webcast. I'm Carl Ross, President and CEO, and Clear on Black is a bespoke interior architectural design firm specializing in upscale and luxury hotels and resorts. We help hotel owners, operators, and developers gain dominating market presence and greater profitability by unlocking the hidden potential of their properties. Our webcasts cover a variety of hospitality design topics that affect owners, operators, developers, as well as architects, purchasing agents, and other allied hospitality team members. I and the occasional guest expert will speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll lay back and take questions for a few more. So today's agenda, we're going to go through a number of things. We have focusing on budget, but a big part of what I want to start off with is a quick recap of the project controls that we've done so far in the prior two iterations that we've talked about here. And if you haven't had a chance to see those before, they are on the website. We'll recap the project controls. We will have budgeting techniques and types and methods. We will have two different components of data, what the source, depth, and accuracy is, as well as the use, timing, and manipulation of data. Then we move to the responsibility, accountability, and compliance component of this. And then finally, an aspect that is, I think, going to be new for some of you, and that is collaborative budget management. And that's an interesting topic that we're going to delve pretty well into today. So the project controls recap. By this, I mean there are essentially a handful of controls that, when brought to bear and utilized, are going to allow projects to run a lot smoother. And understand that I'm coming from the interior design side. So our angle on this is that we've been doing this for quite some time, and we've seen some really good things, and we've seen some not so good things. And so what this 4-part series begins to chip away at and offer out is kind of a collection of best practices, some things that we feel are improvements and things that we can do as part of making our projects run better, and hopefully yours as well. So we have the determining scope and purpose. That's a big part of this. So at the front end of a project, we want to be able to determine the scope and the purpose. And that's kind of sounds like well, yeah, sure. But you'd be surprised at how many times that isn't stated and laid out there. And that's got to be a collective understanding by all team members right from the beginning of the project and the outset. Then second part of it is determining the conditions of satisfaction. And that's really the goals that the collective team has that are not just financial goals. Sure, we want to be able to hit the target budget or have a certain percentage of cost savings below that. But there are softer elements inside of that is setting thresholds for RFIs or change orders, things like that. So determining those costs, yeah, that's one part of it. But the conditions of satisfaction, that's another element that we want to be able to have. Then we have the big three, which are cost, quality, and time. And that was covered in the first webinar, and it's very well outlined. I'm just going to glass across it right here. Having the idea or the notion that one of these three primary drivers is going to determine the focus and the energy driven on a given project. So if it's cost, if it's quality, if it's time, those all need to be determined as which one of those is going to be the primary driver on the project. Then we have SMART goals, and those are goals that are specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timed, so that everything that we move forward on the project we undertake within that filter. Then the next component would be the differentiation document. We talked about that in the last webinar. This really is, I think, such a wonderfully useful tool, and we see it unfortunately rarely used, and it really, really helps define every person's role, what their budget requirements are, what their documentation requirements, administration, purchasing, procurement, all of that, and who is executing it. And it's for every single part in the hotel. So that is a real important piece, and we have that actually available on the website if you want to download that. And then the last piece, obviously, is project schedule, and we talked about that as well. So understanding stop and start times, and that's the easy part, is filling in the intermediate pieces that go with that. So next we're going to jump into the budgeting techniques, and I'm assuming that the people on this call understand budgeting in terms of yeah, there's different ways to do budgets, but what I really want to focus on here is more the usage of the budgets, not so much how you craft and create them. So the first version of it is the top down, which is essentially starting with a lump sum number and making everything in the project scope fit. That's usually the predominance of what we see. Next option would be bottom up, which is also known as zero based. That's incremental building of the budget based on a variety of components to arrive at the final number. And then they have the three that follow here: the rough order of magnitude, the budget estimate, and the definitive estimate are going from most abstract to most specific. And we'll talk about this throughout this presentation, in that the more generic and the faster it is, usually the looser it is and more prone to error it is. So that rough order of magnitude could give you a financial cost delta of minus 25% to plus 75. And you can see that's a huge swing. Budget estimate, which would be about minus 10 to plus 25%, and then a definitive estimate is going to be the tightest, and that's the most granular in detail, and that's going to give you a tighter or the tightest range, and that's going to be minus 5 to 10% on a positive note. Then the last piece in this is analogous estimating, and that is using projects of a quite as nearly similar as possible description, scope, size, market niche, quality level, to determine a range of magnitude. And these kind of interfeed to each other, the rough order of magnitude and, for instance, a combination of the analogous estimating. So we see these used a lot, and those are pretty good. I mean, they're all viable tools at a given point within the project arc. So the next piece is the data. Part one of the data is the source and the depth and the accuracy of that. Well, the sources come in a variety of shapes and sizes. We have means cost data, we have Dodge reports, we have a number of things. Those are essentially historical in nature and are bought online. You can get books, you can get CDs, you can get the documentation on it, and it allows you to calculate the cost of building components. Well, that's great for those kinds of pieces on the GC side. But what about on the FF&E side? Well, we can go to historical, which is based on similar past projects. This is the analogous. So with this, that's pretty reasonable. Those are pretty good. But again, that's history, not current. So depending on the expiration date on your last project and when you're developing that budget number, it may or may not be pertinent. Also, this doesn't necessarily take into account things like differences in union versus non-union labor rates, or small markets like, ski towns or islands where you've got a limited labor pool, things like that. And then the last element in here would be the source being expert sourcing, which is going to be a purchasing agent or a general contractor or a quantity surveyor. So within this body of experts would come very, very solid bot knowledge, because ultimately those are the parties responsible for actually doing the pricing on behalf of the owner, the operator, or the developer, to have it really pulled together. So when you look at that, the more legitimate and the more realistic the pricing, the more time it is going to take to develop it. So in speaking to the owners and operators on this call, I would say that it would be very advantageous to be as realistic as what you want your budget needs. Be realistic about what your budget needs are, and how long have you allocated for the time to be able to create that budget. So at one point I got a call from an inbound call from an unknown person that said, how much does a hotel cost? And it's like, how much is a bag of groceries? How long is a piece of string? There are so many other factors that weigh into it. So you need to be mindful of the realistic aspect of it. If you're going to do something and base the finance of an entire project on something, you need to have pretty realistic numbers to be able to do that. So the second part of data is the use, timing, and manipulation. So when we look at the use of it, who's using the pricing and for what? Here, think about checks and balances, for instance. If only one party develops and checks the budget and nobody else vets it or double checks it, you potentially create unnecessary risk and jeopardize the accuracy of your numbers. We have known of projects where the interior designer will do preliminary design, it goes through documentation, we all come through and create the documentation necessary, and we have, let's say there are multiple towers, and in the distribution matrix, there may be a mistake. And the bigger the project, the more possibility there are for errors. And if there's not a second set of eyes, for instance, the purchasing agent taking a look at, okay, how many of this and how many of that, when you look at the thousands of pieces that go into a high-rise unit or into multiple towers or into a large-scale project, that's a lot of margin of error. And so what we're trying to do here is put a second set of eyes on this and really double-check the pricing, because it's a set of checks and balances, and if you don't use it, it's pretty much at your own peril. So the second part is timing, and that is the amount of time allotted for the budgeting and when in the project is it created. So think of it this way: fast is shallow, deep is slow. So when during the project, if it's too early or too fast, the quality is going to be low. But when the early overall budget umbrella is given out, it is broad brush by definition. So what happens to the design team, and I'm speaking of architect, ID, landscape, the people that are on the creative side, is there's no way that that umbrella piece can possibly have envisioned creative elements such as feature pieces and key iconic pieces that are in a property. So now you're in a situation where you're having to make something unique and special that is germane to the project and truly unique and original fit inside of a budget that it may or may not be able to do. Now, the manipulation. Now, by manipulation, I mean this in the absolute most positive sense possible, and that is the intelligent application of information to be able to quantify and codify every single category, every single pot of money, every single spoken piece of FF&E, OS&E, GC element, all of it, and include risk identification. We're going to talk a good bit about risk identification a little bit more. So think of it this way: what is missing? And if there are elements within the design, and this often happens in the early stages of a project because that's when the new ideas come out, the new unenvisioned things are there, is it possible that you can have known data to help mitigate future problems? So for instance, if you have a feature element that is really special and it's never been done, it's a two-story aquarium or a 3-story aviary or something like that. So at this point, you want to be able to invoke experts. There may be technological things that you can deal with that you can utilize to help solve those problems and bridge that gap. It is possible to look at, for instance, alternative scheduling. If you've got a particularly challenging project schedule and you need to be able to think of different ways to do that, alternative scheduling is one way of dealing with that. And then, of course, there's methods and materials. Oftentimes, we will initiate and begin designs, and we will specifically look to the GC and trade partners to help us hone what the end built solution looks like. Tell us how that could be built, should be built, because we have one idea of how it's done, but rarely is there a single way to do those kinds of things. So the next part of this is the accountability and the responsibility and the compliance. So once the overall budget is established, which discipline has the primary responsibility for developing and maintaining their budget segment. So if it's FF&E on the ID side, probably would be a good idea to have those folks do it. But who else should have oversight? I think, for instance, we ought to have the purchasing agent. There may be a project manager that needs to look at this as well. So that is the oversight that we're looking for. Have other team members contribute. And I talked about this just a moment ago, is feature and specialty elements are especially vulnerable at this point. When does accountability come into play? Well, consider when the budget was created. In the last webinar, we talked about who created a budget. Is it, for instance, the sales director at the hotel that thought that the ballroom was a certain size, or is it the director of engineering that knows it's a certain size? So there are responsible experts that are some being more well adapted to the level of expertise required to set up budgets and establish those things. So the end result of the project largely hinges on that moment. Is that person exactly the right person, and who is accountable for it? So we want to be able to designate that and make sure that you're asking the right people to do that. Then what happens when things go wrong? They do. I guess the question that I often ask is, what strategies are in place to solve the issues? Do you have a mechanism or a system or a protocol in place whereby you can handle stuff when it comes up? So how can you avoid those things or at least mitigate them? And as Mike Tyson so eloquent said, everybody has a plan up until when you get hit. We're going to look now at conventional forecasting, and this is forecasting or budgeting. This is the world that we all live and play and work in. And basically, here's the formula: is that you have a determined fixed cost, and we're going to add design and build to that, and we have fixed amounts for each consultant or trade and trade partner or trade subtrades. Well, within that structure, it dictates a prescribed and predictable set of characteristics, roles, relationships, and sequences. And they're predictable because how this sets things up is very interesting, and we'll talk about this. So when we consider the project arc, we can make changes along the arc from concept and schematic design through even prior to that, from programming to schematic to design development through construction documents and construction administration. So where along that project arc do things go sideways? Where can we make improvements? Where can we be insightful and start looking at things? Well, recently, there's been more and more movement towards an idea called Lean Project Delivery, or LPD. And I'm not going to say that it is a one-size-fits-all and it's a perfect fit for every project, but there are elements inside that are really nice. So what if we are to bring together a team of experts that identify areas of project-wide uncertainty, and then they continue to develop those to minimize cost risk, and then work to define the best use of the finite resource pool, and that's time primarily, to resolve the outstanding questions and issues. So imagine you've got that team of experts. The easy stuff is always the easy stuff. It's the hard stuff, the stuff that hangs you up. That's why we're having this discussion. That's why I'm on this path, because what happens is it's when things get sideways, when things are unknown, those are the slippery places. So when we look at it, every project always has a finite limit of resources, whether that's time or money or budget, people's rates. So the speed at which pooled resources are being used is a critical factor in any project success or failure. So this is known as the burn rate. And to be able to manage that in a meaningful way gives you tremendous control over elusive and unknown and uncontrolled values. So think about this. Identifying areas of the project-wide that are uncertain, that are unknown, and figure out how to minimize the risk on those, and then work to create minimal impact to the resources of the project in solving that. So we look at budget comparison. This is a bit of a contrast. So we're going to look at the world that we currently work and live in, and what's included in that. So in the conventional budget development structure that we all work within, we have an individual participant focus. We're all focused on our own discipline. All trade partners, all consultants, structural covers their stuff, MEP, everybody. Then there's a slow feedback loop in this. There is a lack of responsiveness that starts to come in that because work takes a long time to get done, for the most part, you don't know how well you did until the very end of it. And that's a little bit challenging. So there is a lack of responsive control. Additionally, the team members are siloed. They are hidden from each other, and so consequently, you stick to your own knitting. And a lot of times it matters because sometimes the consultants are not all brought on board at the same time. They are brought in sequentially. They're brought on board, quote, when we need them, we'll get them on board. That's one theory, but a lot can happen in another way. So the other aspect that happens in this is that there can be scope hoarding or scope avoidance. And this largely can be dealt with via the differentiation document, outlining very specifically who's doing what, and I think that's manageable on that side. Then we have a really interesting one, and that is unknown individual outcomes and hidden profits, especially when it's not a known fee. It is more on cost of goods or time and materials. The unknown individual outcomes and hidden profits side of it is because of all the pieces up above. We're siloed, we're hidden from each other, and we don't know really what's going on. Next, poor, if any, shared knowledge, and the goals for each person are insular. That means you're not disclosing what you're trying to achieve, or if you do, it's something very superficial. And because of that, the team rarely learns, and it's very difficult to repeat collaboration for future projects. So I'm going to throw out an analogy here. I said, if we look at it from this route, if this was a professional sports team and this was your structure of how you were going to build your team, what do you think your chances of making it to the playoffs are this year? And then what do you think your chances are of doing it the following year and the following year and the following year? I would say probably not very darn good. So then we're going to look at part 2 of this, and that is the collaborative budget management side. So direct comparison line for line. So we look at individual participant focus becomes an entire project focus for every single team member. We have lack of responsive control and slow feedback to a total team shared cost to complete. Everybody knows what every single thing is related to the cost. Rather than being siloed and hidden from the team, everything is transparent and it is shared. With regard to the scope hoarding and avoidance, the shared and consolidated scope by the entire team is then brought, and there's no place to hide. Now, by the way, most of these trade partners that we're talking about that are collaborative members on this are brought in at the same time. So everybody's on board at the same time. There's no repetition. Everybody knows the purpose, the scope, all of that. So unknown individual outcomes and hidden profits becomes ongoing open monitoring of outcomes and full disclosure of what your declared profit would be. Then poor, if any, knowledge shared, and goals are insular. This is shared goals, shared knowledge. Because we're building, this is a living, breathing organism. This is a team that learns and improves and evolves. And it's not just for the next project, because you've got to get the current one done correctly and tune that. But it is about fostering an idea and fostering a climate of total teamwork. And I keep resonating back with a professional sports team and what that would look like. So collaborative budget management attributes. Well, bad news should be reported immediately and not by proxy. If you remember Robert Duvall in The Godfather playing Tom, the concierge, he insists that Mr. Corleone get the bad news as quickly as possible. I think that's a prudent way to practice. 1 point of aggregation. So we want one person who would be designated as the budget champion that would be collecting, collating, presenting the documents monthly, and they don't have to be responsible for the data, just collecting it, assembling it, and putting it out to the team to be shared. So all team members should participate and bring real numbers. And it also is absolutely essential that they have to be able to stand and deliver on any questions that are arising. So the next part is process should encourage honest and regular sharing. And then finally, we're going to take a look at an element here that is a risk and opportunity register. And what the risk and opportunity ledger or register or list is we talked about on the front end, what are those elements in the project that become unknowns? And you kind of have this little, almost like this little devil sitting on your shoulder saying, hey, you don't know what's going on with that, or I've never done one of those. How are we going to pull this off? So this is an element that is super simple. So it is a key part of the overall strategy in building what I call a visual workspace. It is something that the entire team can share. So it allows every single stakeholder in the project to identify and assess risks and opportunities early, and allows the team to apply intellectual capital to solve stuff rather than financial capital. And we also want to be able to leverage the opportunities. So we want to be able to bring that into the project as a team functional document. It gets done regularly and it gets done early. We want to be able to exercise discipline in terms of maintaining it, prioritizing it, what items are actionable and by when. It's usually more front-end loaded on the project because of the ambiguities and the unknowns. And the last piece is encouraging problem solving. Well, the internal team dialogue often follows if somebody asks me, can you get those drawings done 5 weeks sooner? Yes, if is almost always a qualified scenario. So what we want to be able to do is flesh out those qualifications so definitive action can be taken based on commitments. Last piece is brainstorming for opportunities. Now, the brainstorming for opportunities part is really, it's maybe one of the most important pieces in here, and that is it's thinking in terms of opportunities. It's cost savings, yeah, but it's also methods and means. It's it's scheduling sequences, it's workflow changes. So if you can get your fellow team members to be able to chime in on this, and they are fully present and they're able to help you and work with you, then all of a sudden you start to be able to have this planning element that says, okay, your discussions are able to come cross discipline. And what's astonishing about this is brilliant things come from the most unlikely places. We had a project where the general manager of the hotel, this was a hotel in the mountains, had a golf course, and we were in desperate need of plants, and the planting budget was absolutely just not there. And the general manager realized that we were sitting on 200 acres of adjacent land, and he was able to basically for free grab over 100 pine trees and populate his golf course. And these are fully matured pine trees, and these would be thousands of dollars a piece, and he had over 100 of them, and every single one of them lived. So there's an idea here of being able to brainstorm and come up with opportunities to be able to not only save money but create value for the project. So I'm going to give you a really quick introduction into a sample risk and opportunity register, and basically 7 columns, and I'm going to run through and show you exactly what these are. So the first one is a description. It's a brief explanation of the item or the issue. You have conditions of satisfaction. That is the goals of the team. They may be maximum item budget allowance, and in the instance that the example that I'm showing you here is, we'll follow this across as it develops, but the pricing of the stone for the project has increased 4 times due to a supply limitation. The team had set a cost constraint of X million dollars on this, so we know that we can't exceed a certain budget number. Then the probability. This is a rough guess as to the likelihood that this is even going to occur. Now, this is not scientifically driven. It's not something that is empirically proven. It is something that on a gut check is going to give you an awareness and guide some intelligence and asset to it. So next, cost. And this is a reasonable case worst scenario. So what we're looking for here is give me a ballpark of what this is. So if we look at the product of the percentage and the cost, which is 80% chance at $100,000, we got an $80,000 problem, and that's something significant. And that's something we want to be able to track. So the champion for this, Mr. John Smith, has volunteered, and he's going to chase this until its very bitter end, and that is the sunset date. And the sunset date is basically the date at which this thing needs to be actioned on, or it's a milestone, or it's a discussion of the issue. So what it allows us to do is, as we move into the next piece, we look at the benefits of the collaborative management. So I want to show you the benefits of this that I've introduced. And this is function as one unified team, working together with shared knowledge and goals and problem solving and finding opportunities. I think that when you contrast that with individuals that are independently working towards their own interpretation of the project goals, it often leads to rework, unnecessary expenditure of fees, labor, and materials. I mentioned at the outset, this, in all fairness, it may not be a fit for everyone or for every project, but perhaps some of your takeaway from today is that this new method may be able to implement some elements from this for your project. So this collaborative budget method, it implies a really high level of transparency financially, as well as a strong inter-team integration. So one functional unit as opposed to fragmented and unaligned factions. And what we look at is like, okay, so which team would you like to be on as we head into the playoffs? So the functional unified team or the fragmented team? And I think we probably all have seen examples in sports that are exactly this. So to wrap up, this budget section completes the project palette now, giving us a final set of tools on project budget development, which ultimately, as we look at this whole palette, it starts to guide and manage the projects and allow us to achieve better performance for those. But now that we have this great set of tools, we need only one more thing, and that is a way of communicating efficiently so that we are understood, everything is clear, and that brings us to part 4 in July, and that's coming up. So the upcoming webinar is part 4, project communication and other current issues. In this, we're also going to have intellectual property thoughts and how to manage that. That's going to be a very important part of it. So I'd like to open it up to questions from the group. Oh boy. Okay, question from Rich. Is this risk and opportunity log all there is to collaborative budget management? No. It is one selected piece of an entire project delivery ecosystem. And I mentioned it's Lean Project Delivery, LPD. I have picked specific elements and best practices, quite honestly, which most easily integrate into our company at Clear and Black and our projects to be able to apply there. Some of these are incredibly difficult to do. If you're interested in learning more about LPD in its application, I've written a couple of articles which are on our website that go into the specifics and how it might translate for you. Okay, let's see. We have what are the challenges in trying to implement this budgeting system? Well, the budgeting system has, I think, the biggest challenge. There are several, and one is buy-in on the owner and operator side, the client side, finding a reason to want to do things differently, whether that be a competitive advantage or greater opportunities and efficiencies. It's also getting the team to believe in the possibility, because this is so new and so different, and old dog and new tricks thing is definitely applies. And what I would offer is that I would venture that everybody on this call has had an experience on projects which are graphed kind of like the bell curve. The predominance of them are pretty okay in the center. You've got some highlight stars, superstars on the far right side, but then you got the bad end, not the left-hand side. So what we're wanting to do is, I'm going to ask you, are your mistakes project to project consistent, and have you been able to crack the code on how to solve those? I will say that over the course of 20 some odd years at Clear and Black, I've started to see patterns, and that's what led me on this path of wanting to figure out what more can we do and what more can we bring to bear that are different ways of doing things, different ways of thinking things, so that it's either an improved sequence or enlightenment in some form or another. Hopefully that'll give you some insight to be able to address. So I will also say the learning curve is pretty steep. You would need expert guidance and a true gut check as to what kind of decision maker you and your company are. From my experience in LPD and doing this is that if you are an excellent decision maker, or your company is not encumbered with lots and lots of layers, you will move with great speed, and this could be an astoundingly good fit, and it could give you a tremendous advantage. If, however, you require multiple levels of approval, it will slow down and you will be mired in your own red tape. So I think that is a consideration. I knew this one was going to come. Is this more expensive than the normal way we do it? Yeah, in admin costs, it absolutely is. I would say, to the tune of probably 4 times more admin cost as we applied it in our projects. But here's the thing, that I believe to be offset by the efficiencies and the early awareness of risks. Now, here's the added lagniappe, the piece that is kind of unexpected, and that is that doing things this new way opens up design options and alternatives which can be far more advanced and more, I don't want to say aggressive, but aggressive, that honestly are neutral cost, because you've got an entire team solving the risks as you go. So it's not you trying to figure out how to make that 3-story atrium or that 2-story fish tank. You've got an entire team of experts, and you can enlist additional experts. So team composition obviously is going to be important. I think having people with LPD experience on the GC side and on the architectural side would be very advantageous. You've got to do a culture check for every single company that comes on board, because in order to be able to play this game, you have to have the willingness and the buy-in across the entire culture. And once you do that, you'll have a team that not only functions well, great, and fantastic on this job, but you can start to learn and cultivate that and move it forward so that you can go into the playoffs next year as well. So with that, I think this is a wrap. Thanks all for coming in and being a part of it. I really appreciate it.